I'm just going to encourage. Before I start. Nous sommes le Subcommittee des droits.
Order, please. This is the Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today is Tuesday, February 15th, and this is our 45th meeting.
We are looking into a study on human rights in Iran. I remind members that today's proceedings are televised. I'll also remind our members that we did a very extensive study. It took us over a year into human rights in Iran, but conditions continue to march on, perhaps to deteriorate in that country, and therefore we have a number of witnesses with us today. Our order of business today calls for us to have 3 witnesses. Here in our committee room with us is Payam Akavan, who is a professor from McGill University. Welcome, Professor Akavan. Remotely, joining us from Washington, D.C., is Roya Boramond, and we are supposed to have. Okay, and we have apparently as well from the University of Toronto, Professor Ramin Jahanbegloo. And our clerk is telling me a little bit about how the system works. This is the first time with 2 people on remotes. So rather than me trying to imperfectly explain it, would you be able to just explain to everybody how it works?
Sure. The system is voice activated. Therefore, if you'd like to speak to the witness in Toronto, then just ask for the system to be switched to that witness.
So Dr. Jahanbegloo is not on screen right now for us, but he can see us. Is that correct?
I believe
and
so.
Hear us?
Yes.
Can we just get confirmation, Professor? Can you hear us?
Yes, I do.
Excellent.
I do hear you.
Excellent. Okay, that's fantastic. So, oh yes, and now it's switched for us. Now we see just you, and we no longer see Roya Boramond. Okay, so that's how it all works. What we're going to do then is we will begin with opening statements from our witnesses. We'll start perhaps with Professor Akavan, and then we'll go. I suggest we just take it in the order we've got on our paper, which means Professor Jahanbegloo would go second, and then finally Roya Boramond would go third. When we follow that, we will go to questions from the members. The length of the questions will be dictated by the amount of time we have available to us. We have, of course, only an hour in total. So, Professor Akavan, would you please begin?
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of this committee. It is an honor and a privilege for me to appear before your committee once again. I'm taking advantage of this opportunity to express my great appreciation for the constant attention your committee has given to the situation of human rights in Iran. I am proud as a Canadian of the fact that parliamentarians from all political parties have found this common goal and are pursuing it. Our solidarity with the democratic movement of the Iranian people is a moral imperative and a test of the Canadian leadership on the international scale. In this regard, I commend your subcommittee for its excellent report dated December 2010 and the important recommendations therein. It is my hope that the government will act quickly following these recommendations, as Canada has limited time to contribute to these historic and critical moments in the Middle East.
The streets of Tehran, Shiraz, Mashhad, Tabriz, and other cities across Iran once again witnessed the people's relentless demands for freedom and justice. The Green Movement, representing a broad cross-section of civil society, once again spoke truth to power. it demonstrated the defiance, resilience, and determination of the Iranian people, their refusal to submit to violence and tyranny. The People's Rally was in support of the democratic revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia, but it was also a contest with the regime over ownership of this unprecedented display of people power in the Middle East. Ayatollah Khamenei was quick to portray President Mubarak's downfall as an Islamic revival inspired by the 1979 revolution against the Shah. But the Iranian street had a different interpretation of events, as demonstrated by some of the slogans chanted by the thousands of protesters. Some shouted, "Mubarak Ben Ali, now it's time for Sayyid Ali," referring to Ayatollah Khamenei, reducing the once sacred supreme leader to yet another corrupt dictator in the region. Others shouted, "Down with the Taliban," in Cairo and Tehran, reflecting the rejection of fundamentalism in favor of an open and democratic society. Just as the Iranian Twitter revolution in 2009 inspired civil society in the Arab world, recent events in the Arab world have inspired civil society in Iran. Wael Ghanim, the now famous Egyptian activist and Google executive, remarked how the heroic struggle of the two nations are intertwined by a greater transformation of the region as democratic movements reinforce each other. "I would tell Iranians to learn from the Egyptians," he said, "as we have learned from the Iranians, that at the end of the day, with the power of the people, we can do whatever we want to do. If we unite our goals, if we believe, then all our dreams can come true." However much President Ahmadinejad is eager to portray Mubarak's downfall as a decline of American and Israeli influence, the regime is well aware of the tremendous danger that it represents to its own long-term viability. If the Islamic Republic commends the self-determination of peoples in the Arab world, how can it deny the same to its own citizens? The contradiction is manifest, and it cannot be refuted by any amount of propaganda or repression. Following the post-election protests of 2009, the regime survived only because of extreme violence. In crushing civil society, it also crushed its own legitimacy. The recent events only add to the woes of Iran's authoritarian rulers. It is in this light that we must understand the dramatic deterioration of the human rights situation. As the desperation of the regime increases, so too does its penchant for violence. The obsessive shows of force, whether parading missiles in military spectacles or destroying the nation's youth in torture chambers, is nothing but a sign of the profound weakness of the Ahmadinejad regime. Quite simply, the regime is on the wrong side of history. The will of the people will ultimately prevail, but the question is, at what cost? On 26 June 2009, the radical cleric Ayatollah Ahmad Khatami, no relation to former President Mohammad Khatami, called for the thousands of protesters that had been arrested to be punished without mercy, branding them as enemies of God. Not mincing words, he stated that anyone who takes up arms to fight with the people, they are worthy of execution. That his statements were broadcast on state-controlled television was an ominous sign that the hardliners were preparing the way for mass executions. With its legitimacy shattered, however, the regime was well aware that it could not kill the dissidents all at once, as it did, for example, in the 1980s, when tens of thousands were executed. Instead, it had to incrementally kill, torture, and rape, and throw in some Stalinist show trials and a steady stream of propaganda to destroy its citizens while claiming to protect them at the same time. and constantly gauging the fleeting reaction of the world community to see what it could get away with. In 2008, Amnesty International estimated the number of executions in Iran at 346. In 2009, that number increased to 388, but the figure did not include the scores that were killed and secretly buried after the protests, or whose death was portrayed as resulting from natural causes. According to a mother who went to retrieve her son's body from a makeshift morgue at a meat storage facility in southern Tehran, there were hundreds of bodies in that one location alone. Despite these shocking numbers, which ranked as the highest per capita rate of executions in the world, the situation has dramatically deteriorated this year. In the first 6 weeks of 2011 alone, in what has been described as an execution binge, the number of hangings has risen to 121, based on the government's own public announcements. The toll is likely to be much higher, given that such information is deliberately partial and distorted. For instance, there are credible reports of secret group executions at Vakilabad prison in the city of Mashhad, where an estimated 2,000 prisoners are on death row. Similarly, there are accounts of secret executions in the nearby town of Birjand and many other locations in the country where information is more difficult to access than Tehran. But even if we assume the lower figure of 121 executions thus far this year, this is a staggering rate of 3 hangings a day, every day, 1 every 8 hours. This means that by the end of this year, more than 1,000 Iranians will have been hanged, and possibly 2 to 3 times that number, considering the hundreds of secret executions. Thus, Iran is poised to surpass China as the country with the highest number of executions in the world. Quite simply, the Islamic Republic of Iran is committing mass murder in slow motion. Its campaign of sham trials and hangings is an attempt to terrorize the people into submission, to crush their spirit and their democratic aspirations. The regime is clever enough to know that it cannot get away with large-scale executions, so instead it kills a few here and there, and for those less-known dissidents, it deploys trumped-up charges of drug possession. In a recent statement, the regime sought to legitimize this extermination campaign by cynically claiming that, and I quote, "If the Islamic Republic of Iran decides not to fight drugs, Western and European and other countries will be directly harmed. Many of these executions are to fight drugs, just as international organizations have commended our country for its efforts in this war." End of quote. The case of Zahra Bahrami, a Dutch-Iranian dual national, is a stark illustration of this tactic. She was hastily executed without any notice to her family and secretly buried on 29 January of this year. Although her alleged crime was narcotic-related, she had been interrogated by the intelligence ministry, indicating her real crime was participation in the anti-regime protests of 2009. The Nobel Peace Prize laureate Shirin Ebadi explained that normally when a death sentence is issued, it usually takes 2 to 3 years before the sentence is carried out. No death sentence case has ever gone to implementation with such speed, leading to execution. This could be the signal the Iranian government is sending the opposition and dissidents. Mrs. Ebadi further observes that the Iranian government is afraid that the civil protests of the people of Tunisia, Egypt, and Jordan could spread into Iran. So they decided to use these executions to issue a warning to its critics and to say that it does not intend to compromise under any circumstances, and that the people should not have any hope that they might one day see the Iranian rulers step aside. In brief, Mr. Chairman, Just as the democratic shift in the Middle East intensifies, so too does the violence of the regime. That is why the time to act is now. The time for reticence and hesitation has passed. Until recently, a prevalent conception of the so-called Islamic Middle East was either that oppressed people must be liberated through military intervention, as in Iraq, or that corrupt dictators should be supported to achieve stability, as in Egypt. Many commentators believed that Muslim societies were inherently undemocratic, incapable of the type of social movements that transformed communist Europe in 1989, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But we see today in the Middle East that Arabs and Iranians also want freedom and nonviolence. They also want equality and human rights. They also have dignity and hopes for a better and peaceful future. And that we in the West have not always been on the right side in this historical struggle. So now is a unique opportunity to finally build the new Middle East that a few years ago most would have dismissed as impossible. And Canada must rise to the occasion and ensure that it makes a befitting contribution to these great historical events that are irreversibly changing the shape of the world. In this light, it is my sincere hope that the Government of Canada will expeditiously adopt the recommendations of this subcommittee's December 2010 report. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Professor. We'll now go to Dr. Jahanbegloo.
Mr. President, honorable members of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me as an Iranian Canadian to share with you my testimony on the situation of human rights in Iran. Nearly 2 years after Iran's tainted presidential elections, the Iranian civic movement remains one of the most promising indigenous democracy movements in the history of Iran and the Middle East. While its path remains long and arduous, the movement has already transformed the way democracy, nonviolence, and human rights are conceived, talked about, and fought for in Iran. This movement managed to carry out one of the largest spontaneous demonstrations in contemporary Middle East history by some estimates 3 million people. During the unrest after the elections, the regime was caught off guard by the Green Movement's demonstrations. Security forces were initially paralyzed by the members and by the number of the participants, and the government took drastic measures in an attempt to regain control and quell the uprising in the streets. The government placed a ban on all opposition rallies and unleashed security forces, including Revolutionary Guards, units of the Basij paramilitary units, and plainclothes paramilitary forces. Thousands of protesters were beaten, around 5,000 were arrested, and dozens were killed by snipers. In the fall of 2009, more than 100 of the Green Movement's most important leaders, activists, and theorists appeared in show trials reminiscent of Joseph Stalin's infamous trials in the 1930s. They were accused and they were forced to confess on television to several crimes against the nation. Not all the detainees made it to trial. The torture and death of prisoners in the Kahrizak prison became a lingering source of political embarrassment for the regime. Of the countless human rights abuses that afflicted Iran over the last year, 3 became particularly prominent. The first was the case of Neda al-Sultan, the 27-year-old woman who was shot during the initial round of post-election protests. The second was...
I'm sorry, just a moment. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we have some background noise that's drowning out your voice. I'm not sure if it's at your end or if it's possibly at Ms. Bourmon's end, or possibly it's also something else. We'll just take a moment. Our tech people can indicate that it's being dealt with.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Let's try. let's try again. Please continue, Professor. My apologies.
Yes. The second case was that of Mohsen Ruhul Amini, the son of a conservative politician who was detained in Kahrizak prison along with other protesters, and he died 2 weeks later amid reports that when his parents received his body, his face was smashed in. The third prominent case was that of Mehdi Karoubi's public disclosure of the systematic rapes of detainees by their interrogators. In each of these cases, a handful of individuals emerged to publicly disclose and egregious human rights violations committed by the state. Common among those individuals was a sense that the truth about the regime's violence can no longer remain unspoken. As such, for the past 18 months, Iranians all over the world have displayed a similar sensibility. They have reported and made public cases of death, torture, or rape, or they have simply expressed their mutual indignation in regard to the degree of cruelty practiced by the Iranian regime. In fact, not only has the Iranian civil society created the social and cultural spaces to openly call the regime's worst atrocities by their names, it has also taken on an impressive project of meticulously documenting these violations. While the regime continues to shut down newspapers, magazines, and websites close to the Green Movement, placing Iran in the first rank as the country with most imprisoned journalists, Iranian civic actors around the world continue to insist on a daily basis on the international standards of human rights and democracy. The most serious need for Iran's civic movement is moral responsibility of the international institutions and democratic governments to help it. Smart sanctions focused on weakening the regime's ideological and oppressive apparatus can facilitate the maturation of this movement, but a military assault could kill the movement for the foreseeable future. That is why, as an active and well-known member of the Iranian-Canadian community, I urge the Canadian government to do more than just write reports about the people who are facing detention, torture, and death for demanding their rights. Every time someone speaks up and asks the Canadian government to do more than just impose sanctions and help the Green Movement further, the common criticism is, well, what can Canada do without interfering in the domestic affairs of a sovereign state? But there are many things that Canada can do to help the Green Movement and the civic actors in Iran, things that would not only help the civic actors but would also not be considered direct interference in the internal affairs of another state. Thousands of activists and supporters have crossed the border into Turkey since violence against them began. However, dissidents face a critical situation. Refugees are not permitted to permanently reside in Turkey, though many hope for a temporary escape from the regime. These men and women need immediate help in finding a safe haven. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard's long arms are probing for them in Turkey, and regime agents easily cross the border as there is no visa requirement between the two countries. The Canadian government can and should provide these dissidents refuge on its own soil and put diplomatic pressure on Turkey to stop the violence and intimidation against them. I am fully aware and support Canadian government's efforts to get international community to open its eyes to the atrocities committed by the Islamic Republic by continuing to prepare and support resolutions in the United Nations to condemn Iran's flagrant human rights abuses. While sanctions against Iran are important, resolutions that recognize that regime's brutality are equally important as they deter the general public of the United Nations member states from supporting their government's favorable stance regarding Iran. This said, I think that most of the members of the Iranian community in Canada and human rights activists are asking for Canada's greater support for Iranian civil society, documenting abuses and disseminating information within Iran. I add to this Canada's role in promoting virtual teaching and training of nonviolence in Iran. I ask humbly the honorable members of the subcommittee to recommend the organization of a Center for Promotion of Nonviolence in Iran, which endeavors to promote a culture of peace and nonviolence. Last but not least, as an Iranian Canadian, I feel particularly concerned by the uncertain fate of two Canadians of dual nationality who remain in prison in Iran. As you know, Mr. Hossein Darakhshan, a Canadian-Iranian blogger, is still in prison in Iran, and Mr. Saeed Malekpour, a Canadian permanent resident, has been condemned to death, and his sentence may be carried out at any time. Mr. Malekpour's case is but of many cases in which someone in Iran is facing a death sentence after a highly questionable process. As a relentless advocate of human rights, the Canadian government, along with the international community, is strongly urged to raise its voice louder and to hold Iran to account for this and other violations of human rights by asking Iranian authorities to free Mr. Malekpour and to provide a fair and due process for all its citizens, including those with dual citizenships. As we can see, Iran is not Egypt. Although the Iranian regime did claim partial credit for Egypt's uprising, yesterday's Green Movement's march in Tehran and the brutal reaction of the Iranian regime to peaceful protests showed once again that it's unlikely that Iran's leaders will tolerate any kind of political opening in the near future. It goes without saying that Iran's government is facing a day-to-day challenge from its own people, but Canada should continue to put pressure on the Iranian government not only by using diplomatic channels or international institutions, but also by giving a voice to all voiceless members of the Iranian community in Canada whose rights have been violated by the Iranian regime. If I can end on these words of Reverend Martin Luther King, who once said, "He who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who helps to perpetrate it. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it." I have been quoting this in the case of Iran many times, and I hope it doesn't fall again onto deaf ears. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Professor. We'll now turn to our third witness, Ms. Roya Bourramond. And let's see if she comes up on screen. There we go. We can see you, and we encourage you to begin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the subcommittee, for your persistent attention to the human rights situation in Iran and for allowing us to testify at a time when we are witnessing a serious human rights crisis in Iran. I would like to draw your attention today to two issues that are related and are causing serious concerns among human rights activists. The first issue is the death penalty, the judicial process leading to the death penalty, and related topics such as criminality. The second issue is activism in Iran and the situation of rights defenders. The choice of this talk is linked to current events in Iran, but also to observations resulting from many years of research. As you know, as you just heard, in the months of January 2011, close to 100 individuals were reportedly executed in Iran. And approximate 70% of the convicted prisoners were sentenced for drug-related offenses. This number is a record high in many years in a country that has consistently been one of the highest rates of executions per capita in the world. What makes it crucial for us to reflect on this issue is not only the cruelty of the death penalty and its failure in terms of eradicating criminality, but also the fact that those who are prosecuted as common criminals are often among the most vulnerable in the Iranian society. Poverty, the absence of formal education, as well as lack of serious attention by the media and civil society in their cases, weaken their ability to defend themselves. Also, the process leading to executions is marked by violations such as the denial of the right to defense and torture, the use of coerced confession in trials are routine. There is a persistent trend in the Islamic Republic that encourages arbitrary arrests, speedy processes, and summary trials, and views defense attorneys as obstacles to the enforcement of justice. And finally, the institutionalization of violence against ordinary Iranians and the establishment and persistence of flawed judicial processes facilitates the attack on activists and protesters in general when the need arises, as it happened, for example, in the Kahrizak detention center in 2009. Today, several political prisoners are on death row with a process that is very, very opaque and with charges that are very difficult to prove. If you don't mind, ladies and gentlemen, as a historian, I will take you back 30 years and look at the history of the death penalty in Iran, and in particular with a particular focus on death penalty for drug dealing and drug addiction. Judicial authorities in Iran, like their counterparts in China, do not publish numbers and do not allow independent monitoring of cases involving the death penalty. The Islamic Republic's authorities deliberately withhold information on executions. I can refer to, for example, Ayatollah Fazl, the head of the Shiraz courts, who, for example, noted a couple of years ago that since it's inappropriate to make daily statements to the public about executions and to provide detailed information regarding the cases, court officials prefer that not all of them be reported, end of quote. Yet, based on data available, mostly through official reports, the number of executions in Iran are revealing. In 2007, we collected reports of 468 executions, 189 of which were drug-related. In 2009, we collected reports of 408 executions, 171 of which were drug-related. In 2010,
excuse me, Madam Bourmand, I'm just going to ask, just for the sake of the translators, if you could slow down just a tiny bit. They're having trouble keeping up with you as they translate into French. You needn't worry that we're going to cut you off, so please take your time.
Okay. In 2010, 337 executions were reported, 249 of which were drug-related. The enforcement of the death penalty in Iran deserves special attention, given a wealth of evidence pointing to widespread disregard for due process of law, as well as multiple and systematic violations of defendants' rights. The authorities, for example, do not necessarily inform accused individuals of their rights, do not allow them to access a lawyer during interrogation, may subject them to serious abuse should they refuse to incriminate themselves. Judges sometimes suggest to defendants to forego their right for an attorney during the trial in exchange for a more lenient judgment. A defendant is often unable to examine witnesses or evidence or take other steps necessary to the presentation of a proper legal defense. In cases involving allegations of drug possession or trafficking, on which some official data and statements are available, shortcomings in the law and in practice have grave and lethal consequences. Anti-narcotic laws making executions mandatory for drug possession, the absence of genuine accountability for judges, hasty sentencing procedures encouraged by overcrowded jails, and the lack of independent monitoring are contributing to a flawed judicial process that has led to thousands of executions over the 3 decades of the Islamic Republic's existence. Based on the information collected by ABF, the number of reported drug-related executions rose from more than 60 in 1979 to close to 400 in 1980 and nearly 600 in 1984. Chronic anti-narcotic campaigns have been launched since, leading to the arrest and conviction of hundreds of thousands of alleged addicts and traffickers. In January 1989, a new law made the execution of those in possession of a certain amount of drugs mandatory. In 1995, an official of the revolutionary courts in Tehran noted that a law passed in November 1994 in the framework of the campaign against narcotics had allowed those arrested on drug charges to be prosecuted and sentenced in less than 48 hours. According to official statements, in the Iranian year 1378, 1998-99, 15,869 people were sentenced to death for drug-related offenses. Even though a high percentage of those sentenced to death were not executed, an estimated 5,000 people were executed for drug trafficking between 1995 and 2005. The official statements stressing the decisiveness of the security forces and the judicial authorities abound throughout the history of the Islamic Republic. Most recently, the highest authority approving death penalties, the head of the Supreme Court, Ayatollah Mohsen Garakani, stressed, quote, "Our life's well-being and calm depends on these executions," end of quotes. He expressed satisfaction about the speedy and radical action of the judiciary in dealing with criminality. This violence in the name of combating criminality, however, has done little to eradicate addiction and trafficking, for example. Official statistics in the first decade of the 21st century do not allow optimism. Iranian officials recognize that Iran continues to face a drug crisis. In 2005, 60% of the prison population was serving term for drug offenses. In 2008, officials have estimated the number of individuals arrested and detained in Iranian prisons every year to more than 700,000. 200,000 people were arrested between March and September 2010 for addiction or drug dealing. According to the head of the prison organization, today drug dealers constitute more than 50% of the prison population, as opposed to 5% before the revolution, 1979 revolution. The increasing number of drug offenses and high rates of addictions in Iran has not led those in a position to change policies to reflect on the past. On the contrary, law enforcement officials, as well as high-ranking members of the judiciary, continue to devise policies and make statements announcing a tougher approach. These policies include an increase in the number of executions. Several secret group executions of drug offenders in Mashhad were reported last summer after a delegation from the prison organization visited the city's central prison in early August 2010 with the stated goal of investigating the overcrowding caused by the high number of prisoners doing time on drug charges. The delegation mandate is to organize work camps dedicated to the detention of drug offenders. This project is too similar to the one devised a few years ago to deal with the so-called hooligans, which led to the use of detention places such as Kahrizak. Bringing about changes, ladies and gentlemen, in a state's behavior in terms of human rights violations requires accurate and detailed information. Most of us outside Iran rely on the information collected and transmitted by Iranians who hope for and fight for the respect of human rights standards. If those of us old enough to remember the 1979 revolution and its aftermath are hopeful today, it is because the Iranian people, and in particular the Iranian youth, has come a long way. For many years, I was haunted by the image of young and committed activists believing in a better Iran and yet standing on the sides of Tehran's avenue and holding signs calling for more summary executions. Today, young Iranians, for the most part, reject violence. Over the years, several human rights groups have been created and attracted support and activists. Student groups supporting hostage-taking in the 1980s are now filled with activists reporting on human rights violations and calling for democracy. Journalists, bloggers, various citizen associations have joined the movement, drawing attention to the need for change. The state's response to this successful mobilization has been violent. Intimidations, arrests, beatings, and sometimes executions are part of a concerted effort to silence activists and deprive the Iranian people and the international community from information on human rights violations. In the past year and a half, the cost of human rights and pro-democracy activism has become increasingly heavy. From punishments such as harassment, arbitrary detention, banning from school, closure of associations or magazines, and suspended prison sentences for those who collected signatures to change discriminatory laws, tried to defend political prisoners, reported on torture or on other human rights violations, today firm prison sentences on charges of acting against national security, for example, ranging from 2 to 12 years. Sometimes in prisons in exile, is awaiting undeterred activists. The situation for activists who do not have a high profile and are not nationally or internationally known is even more difficult. Since the summer of 2009, and in the face of the heavy cost of activism, many Iranians have been forced into exile. Today, scores of human rights activists, students, journalists, and bloggers from diverse political and social backgrounds have left and are awaiting, sometimes in great hardship, the end of this human rights crisis. Many of us established outside Iran try to help, and we can and keep these activists relevant. However, it takes more than a handful of small organizations or individuals to keep this new wave of exiled activists relevant and show to the Islamic Republic's government that it will be as costly, if not more, for their image internationally and nationally to force human rights activists into exile. I hope that the subcommittee will consider recommendations that are aimed at helping these activists remain relevant and prevent a return to the mass violence of the 1980s, as I fear the government is tending toward. You can give visibility to the flaws in the judicial process, pay attention to details, include cases of ordinary criminals. Iranian authorities do react positively when their interlocutors are informed of details and point out at specific instances where national and international laws as well as Sharia laws are violated. Information is key. Support those who do collect and publicize information on human rights violations. The work that we or other groups do depends heavily on those inside Iran who investigate and report. It is crucial to show support for this kind of efforts by not allowing those who are in prison to be forgotten and those who are forced to leave to become irrelevant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, we've had three witnesses, very thorough testimony, but of course also that's taken quite a bit of time. What I propose to do is to have the committee run until 10 past the hour. That's 10 minutes beyond our normal sitting time. That will give us time to have one 5-minute question per party. And I'm sorry, is there a problem, Mr. Marsden?
It's not a problem, but it might be worthwhile. We have a viewing audience. We have our guests to speak as to the status of our report that we've already completed. We had 24 recommendations, and just so people are aware of the status, if you might do that.
Oh, sure. Why don't I let committee members do that? I'll just finish saying that we'll have 5 minutes for each party. I think in the interests of time, what we'll ask each questioner to do is direct your question towards one of the witnesses. Only that witness will answer, and then if any of the other witnesses think there's something worth commenting on, they'll have to wait until they have an opportunity to answer to another question. Otherwise, I think we'll simply not be able to get completed in time. So with that said, we will start with Professor Kotler from the Liberals.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to express our appreciation to all three witnesses for their graphic and compelling testimony about the human rights situation, I would say crisis as they have put it, in Iran, dramatized by the execution binge and the underpinning of assaults that accompany it. I'm going to, as you suggested, put a question to Professor Akavan. As Mr. Marsden mentioned, a report was tabled by the Foreign Affairs Committee with regard to a series of both findings of fact, conclusions of law, specific recommendations. I note, Professor Akavan, that you recommended that we adopt and act upon those recommendations in the report. And so my question to you is as follows. Number one, are there any recommendations, as you've read the report, that are not in our report that you would make to us? And number two, are there amongst the recommendations those you think we should prioritize? And if you could also comment on not only the execution binge, but the recent assault on the lawyers in Iran who have been representing the victims of human rights violations. Thank you.
I will begin, Professor Kotler, thank you for your question. We'll begin with your second question. We have a very unusual situation in Iran where it is not only lawyers that are defending political prisoners that are being put in prison, but the lawyers of lawyers representing political prisoners are also being put in prison. And this is part of an overall climate of repression where the regime doesn't want to tolerate any dissent whatsoever. And defending someone against false accusations in a court in Iran is considered somehow counter-revolutionary and can land you in jail. So one sees here, compared, for example, to the relative relaxing of this climate under the tenure of President Khatami, one sees a regime that is going backwards full speed. And as I tried to explain in my testimony, this is really a sign of the fear of the regime that it will lose its grip on power. So we have two competing forces. One is the demands of the majority of people for an open society, for democracy, and the increasingly violent repression of a small minority. In terms of the recommendations of the committee, I think the report is an excellent report. There are many very good recommendations, and I would hope that most of them would be recommended. If I was to prioritize some of them, I would look, first of all, at the political level at following the lead of other countries in pursuing targeted sanctions against officials of the Islamic Republic that are responsible for crimes against humanity. In September, President Obama issued an executive order which blacklists 8 Iranian officials, not because of their participation in the nuclear program, but because of their responsibility for massive human rights violations. The European Parliament recently adopted a resolution to that effect, and I would hope that Canada, even if it's purely symbolic, because symbolic gestures are very important in the psychological war that's going on in Iran, I think that Canada should follow suit, have a commission of inquiry, determine which officials were implicated in the crimes against humanity following the elections of 2009, and send the message that governments, not just human rights activists, that governments are going to one day hold these individuals to account. I would also, perhaps in a self-serving way, urge you to prioritize recommendation 23, I believe, of the report, which is support for the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, of which Roya Burumand is also a fellow board member. I think, as she explained, documentation, as Professor Jahan Beglu also explained, documentation based on credible sources is extremely important for developing the kind of consciousness which in turn allows for the mobilization of the masses that demand justice and accountability. And to open actually an office in Canada, as recommended by the report, for the Documentation Center, I believe would send exactly the right message to the Iranian community in Canada and to the democratic movement in Iran.
All right. That uses up the first round. Madame Deschamps, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much. I also would like to take this opportunity to thank the 3 witnesses who have told us about the situation of human rights in Iran. I'd like to continue with you, Mr. Akavan, perhaps in the same vein as Mr. Kotler. In your presentation, you did tell us about your appreciation of the report that was published last year by the committee, but you added one small sentence saying that Canada has limited time. Can you perhaps tell me a bit more about that, expand on that, about the issue of limited time? Just that small sentence. Thank you, Ms. Deschamps.
as I explained, until recently, most observers did not see what was coming. Very few people predicted what would happen in 2009 in Iran. Even fewer predicted what would happen in Egypt and Tunisia. That's because we're far too focused on politics as factional fighting among elites and not sufficiently informed about the temperature on the streets. And this is really about who controls the streets. This is what people power is about. So in that sense, I think that the course of events in the Middle East are accelerating. It's a very volatile transition in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Jordan, in Iran. And I just think it would be most unfortunate if we were to say, as the expression goes, to miss the boat, given Canada's international standing, given our commitment to human rights, given how much emphasis we've put on democratization in a region of the world which many people thought was exempt from what happened everywhere else in the world, now is the time for us to step forward and participate in this historic process. And my point about time being short is that I believe we should already have acted. And if we don't act now, then we will simply be sidelined.
You still have 2 minutes. Yes, just to draw that link with the fact that the international community was perhaps lagging in this regard. In Tunisia, we look at other countries, and in fact, the Ben Ali family, again, people are asking Canada to do certain things with respect to the situation in Egypt. The U.S. are perhaps reluctant to be in agreement with the protesters and backing civil society. So from that perspective, we always get the sense that our countries, Canada, the U.S., are sort of lagging behind the rest of the international community as to what's being done in reaction to what's happening over there out of some fear. There's the economic aspect, which plays a significant role. I'm not sure if you understand what I'm trying to say, but it seems to me, though we are lagging behind, there's some leaders, you know, I mean, Canada, the United States, in my opinion, we could be a bit more present on the international scene and more active than we are currently.
I would say to what is a very good but complex question, simply that I would hold Canada to a higher standard than I would hold other countries in the West, frankly speaking. The European Union is still the biggest trading partner of Iran. And I would say the Europeans' record on Iran is very unfortunate. The United States has a very different history. So in a sense, Canada is uniquely positioned to do more than other countries. And it's in that regard that I would hope that the government acts to recommend, to adopt the excellent recommendations made by this subcommittee.
Okay, Mr. Marston, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I hope I don't butcher our guest's name, Buraman, in Washington. I'd like to direct some comments to you. All of the testimony have one striking similarity that we're hearing today, and that's the massive increase in executions over the recent weeks. And to my mind, following the elections in Iran and the uprising, this regime was very clearly preparing itself to block any move in the future to any form of democracy in that country. And Dr. Akavan talked about assembling of information. And I think in some senses the word information was what led to the uprising in Egypt and bred the conditions. Dr. Akavan spoke of having a center, I believe you suggested, in Canada. But my question to you would be, do you see that more effective somewhere closer on the ground? Should it be something administered by the United Nations or by international governments on their own case?
This is a difficult question because I think that several measures should be taken together. Regarding Mr. Akhavan's project, I guess the more we have human rights documenting, the more the international community will be informed. But my concern is more serious for the activists who are leaving Iran or those who are in prison, because I think that without them we will not be able to do any documentation. We also, as individuals and groups living in democracies and as governments, democratic governments, should not give the activists the impression that they are useful while they are giving us information and they are useless once they can't. And I think that with the technology today, the situation is much different than in the 1980s. You know, we left Iran and we lost touch because it was dangerous to be in touch and it was not easy to be in touch. These activists are in touch because they can. There is technology that allows them to be in touch. But if they cannot do anything about the information they get from their counterparts in Iran, they will not be able to keep the contact. They will become irrelevant. So I think that it is very crucial for governments and civil society and donors, the donor community, to think through and to devise projects that will, and not only for Iran, but of course Iran is today our subject, but to devise projects that would actually provide some training, language, intensive language training, some psychological care, and some training for journalists, for human rights activists by their peers here, and some training on advocacy and the way the system works outside Iran and in the UN, so that they have something to transmit to their friends in Iran, but they also don't feel like they have been forgotten because they have left.
The committee report that we did earlier had suggestions in it for our government around helping on the ground and here in Canada with the precisely what you're talking about, giving those supports. I don't know who to direct this question to, but if anybody might have the answer, is there any evidence as to where the regime has invested their money around the world? I mean, information is one thing, and seizing their assets is quite another thing. Is there any documentation that anybody is aware of that could lead us as a country to any funds here in Canada?
Perhaps I'll just quickly say that if the Canadian government invests resources, I'm sure they can find out. And this is the problem, that this is not something a group of activists can do. Dubai, United Arab Emirates, seems to be now the biggest economic hub, and there are thousands of front companies which the regime uses to bypass the sanctions. There are accounts of the stories of bank accounts in the UK, in Switzerland, in Germany. The point is that all we have is hearsay, rumors, for which Iranians have a great talent. The point is to make governments take seriously. How many economic migrants in Canada are actually screened properly when they show up with several $1 million in their bank accounts and no one really knows what they were doing, and we don't really want to ask questions because we want their funds. And if I may just very quickly, Mr. Marston, also following your question, say that if we could set up a documentation center in Iran, surely that's what we would do. And under the present circumstances, we in the diaspora are trying to support efforts within the country to do certain things which are not possible. And further to what Dr. Burman said, one of the activities which NGOs can do is training, as she said. Now, I'd rather not talk too openly about training, because the question is, where do you do it in order to make sure that people from Iran have access and that they don't end up in prison when they go back? But there is a tremendous opportunity for training people in everything from languages to computer technology, to leadership, to nonviolent resistance tactics. all this to say that funds can go a very, very long way when directed in a concentrated way.
Thank you very much. Now we turn to Mr. Sweet.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. On that last note, I might just mention that it may be worthwhile in the not-too-distant future for us to have an in-camera session with the witnesses that we have now to speak on more specifics that, as Dr. Akavan has mentioned, would probably not be appropriate to do in public. And although we couldn't report on them, it would give us context for things that we'd investigate in the future and make us more apt to be able to report accurately. But I have to say, listening to all the testimony, I listed some of the things here. Certainly this isn't exhaustive, but you know, the regime in Iran continues to ramp up their impunity with sham trials, trumped-up drug charges, false report of natural causes of death, torture, rush secret executions, the jailing of advocates, and then of course lawyers, I guess, is going down, and it just seems to me that as the people rise up with more spirit, that they just want to address that in a way that's more tyrannical than before. So of all the testimony I've heard two things echoed, and I just want to confirm it with the witnesses, that the most effective thing that we can do is support those who document and report, and also to take the time to develop targeted sanctions that would specifically cripple the regime, or at least work towards that end, but yet not be detrimental to the people of Iran, who are themselves the ones who are doing the job in the movement towards democracy. So I'll just leave that for any of the witnesses to comment upon.
Maybe what we'll do then is we'll go to whoops. We'll move my BlackBerry out of the way. First of all, why don't we go to Professor Jahangavlu, who hasn't had a chance to comment yet.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to add to my two colleagues in Washington and in Ottawa that I've also read the report which was done by the subcommittee and the report of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development, and I very thoroughly and closely, and I want to congratulate you on that. I have two recommendations in relation to recommendation to number 8 and number 24. I would just add that in the recommendation number 8, you mentioned in the report to deny, the subcommittee recommends to the government of Canada to deny entry to security agencies and to Revolutionary Guards. I would, and the Basij militia, of course. I would add to second Professor Ahavan's suggestion that it's better to write that Canada denies entry to those who are implicated mainly in the political crimes and close collaboration with the Iranian regime. And I would add, if I may, that in nowhere, if I understand well, in the recommendation there is a point to ensure to ask the government of Canada to ensure protection for Iranian dissidents and refugees who are already in Canada, mainly Iranian Canadians. As for number 24, I would suggest only one thing which I mentioned in my testimony, and that was eventually if we have to help those who are engaged in nonviolent action and resistance in Iran, it would be very much, I think, a good idea eventually to ask a subcommittee to recommend the government of Canada to help a virtual training of nonviolence, actually for the Iranian resistance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're right out of time, so I apologize. Mr. Heber did have a question, but we're out of time. This gives me the opportunity then to thank all three of our witnesses. We're very grateful for the testimony you've been able to provide. Before I dismiss the committee, were you going to pursue anything, Mr. Silva? Or?
No, there are some changes to the motion, so I'll wait for next meeting.
Wait for this. Okay.
But
and
I just want to say to the members that I did bring the motion forward last week's meeting, so I was hoping that members would have a chance to take a look at it, so that there'd be hopefully a debate today's meeting. Yeah, no, I know. There's just some changes to the language that's presented by the board.
Okay, so let's let that wait. Then perhaps members can discuss this particular motion, which is on a different subject, outside of committee time, and perhaps we can come to an agreement at the beginning of next meeting, if in fact there is a consensus. That being said, we are adjourned. Thanks everybody for giving me the extra time to do proper questions.